Thank you, David, very much. And that lunch was superb, and I'm amazed that everybody has come back after it. I mean, normally a lunch will put people who are at a conference on a different path, but that's a sign of a very well-organized conference, not, at least in the case of this speaker, the draw of the next speaker. But in any event, thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk about how leaders govern and how governance is actually related to democracy. It is related to democracy. In fact, how you govern, in fact, has a great deal to do with it, as we'll see. And I'm going to give you a somewhat novel perspective on what's happening here in the United States by taking you abroad, as David says, and introducing you to the president's favorite European leader. And when I say the president's, I mean President Trump, of course. European leader Viktor Orban and Orban's formula for transforming democracy through governance into authoritarianism. So as you know, and let me give you just one little hint of what this is going to look like, if I can get this to properly work. Yes, there they are. I've just introduced you to Viktor Orban. As you know, Orban is the longtime leader of Hungary. He's a political model for our president. So his rule is a window into what the United States might look like under Trump. The similarity between the Trump and Orban governance personae is striking. And based on the past few weeks, I'd say our president even seems to be outdoing Orban, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Whether he can succeed as an authoritarian in the U.S. the way Orban has succeeded in Hungary will depend on how Americans react to what's happening here. So here's another perspective on this relationship, which is a very important way to introduce this subject. You know, to understand how Viktor Orban got his start, let's look back to the events in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The pace of change in the early 90s was dizzying. I was very much there and seeing it all happen. The forces propelling democracy seemed to be unstoppable. Political walls separating East and West collapsed, democratic elections and free markets sprang up everywhere. A divided Germany was reunited. The Soviet Union was dissolved. The European Union expanded eastward, and a new global economy seemed to be taking over the world. These changes led one optimistic observer at the time to predict that democracy would be the final form of government. But there were other factors at work, less visible at first, but eventually producing other kinds of changes. International companies began moving their factories out of Europe and the US to Asia. Neoliberal shock therapies applied by American economists in many cases were cutting social spending in the new democracies. Services provided by the old regimes were replaced unevenly by capitalism. Corruption broke out as state assets were privatized. Bank bailouts and lending crises shook the financial system. Economic inequality grew between the new oligarchs of privatization as the assets of the old state regimes were privatized and everyone else. And then came the massive flow of refugees into Europe from the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and North Africa. And all of this led to the rise, perhaps not surprisingly, in retrospect at all, certainly based on what we've said, what's been said already in this conference, the rise of xenophobic populist politics. First in Hungary and then across Europe, populist pushback against the huge, disruptive, and disorienting changes that were affecting so many people. And this is when the assault on democracy began. And for 7 years, I was in the middle of it in Hungary, where I was the president of Central European University, as you've heard. And I saw firsthand how a politician like Viktor Orban could very effectively manipulate a populist rebellion to take over a democracy and govern it as an authoritarian regime. And when my term at CEU ended in 2016, my wife Ellen and I, of course, who's here, returned to the US in time for the first election of Donald Trump. And our friends at the time, I can remember joking that maybe we were carrying the Hungarian anti-democracy disease back to the US. But the disease had already spread, as you've heard, certainly in the US, but also in Europe. By 2014, a European Commission poll had shown that 70% of Europeans distrusted their elected governments, up from only 25% in 2002. In Eastern Europe, people were feeling left behind by the loss of jobs, stagnating incomes, austerity programs, and cuts in social welfare, all products of the economics of globalization. And by 2010, Hungary had become a laboratory for populism, a decade before it came to the rest of Europe. The financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 hit the Hungarians very hard, and many began to feel that they were now no better off than they had been under communism. Hungarians have a deep-seated victim mentality, the product of centuries of invasions by Mongols, Turks, Russians, Austrians, Germans, and Soviets, and the Hungarian civil society was therefore badly stunted and never really grew as a result of these outside dominations. And on top of that, the country was deeply divided between a majority rural population that speaks only Hungarian and a cosmopolitan minority who were the dominant elite. And this really set the stage. It's the circumstances out of which Viktor Orban rose, and he walked in to take advantage, if you will, of these circumstances, or at least to fashion a system of governance that he felt was appropriate for the time. Orban had been a hero of the democracy movement that overthrew the old regime. He had good organizing and rhetorical skills, which he used to stimulate Hungarians' sense of victimization. He attacked the European Union as the new Moscow, as he put it. He railed against refugees, calling them a threat to Christian civilization. He campaigned on the memorable slogan, which we came to hear much later, "Make Hungary Great Again." And he promised Hungarians he would rescue them from migrants and foreigners and people of other races and religions. And above all, and this is probably his most important contribution, he created a new identity politics in Hungary by offering the vision of, as he put it, a great Hungarian nation. Of course, it had a history of being part of the Habsburg Empire, and it felt that it was great in that way. A great Hungarian nation as a way to prop up a worn-out and disintegrating society. So Orban boasted that he would build a new form of government, which he called illiberal democracy, a sort of Orwellian term he invented to justify turning an election into an instrument to undermine democratic institutions. After he was elected in 2010, he maneuvered his narrow electoral victory into a supermajority in the parliament, paving the way to rewrite the Hungarian constitution. He took over the media through government regulation, censorship, and financial pressure, and today he controls 85% of the average Hungarian sources of information. He undermined the judiciary and the rule of law by expanding and packing the Constitutional Court with loyalists, forcing independent judges to retire, cutting back the court's jurisdiction, and drastically revising the Constitution. He built a governing base out of the new oligarchy of corrupt businesses who had benefited from non-competitive government contracts with funding that was supplied indirectly by EU grants to Hungary as a new EU member state. The grants totaled nearly 30 billion euros before they were finally suspended by the EU in 2020, when Hungary was held by the European Court of Justice to be violating the EU's basic rule of law requirements. Orban systematically weakened Hungarian civil society, branding organizations that received funding from abroad, from the US or from Europe, as foreign agents, conducting harassment investigations of critics and taking away the academic freedom of universities. Now, as I said, I was running an international university, chartered in the US, but with students from over 100 countries, graduate institution, whose mission was to revive academic freedom in Eastern Europe. During the Obama presidency, when the US promoted academic freedom, I was able to protect CEU from Orban and expand its academic programs and its campus. And it was a proud achievement in that respect. But when Trump was elected in 2016, he endorsed Orban. Orban took the gloves off and started attacking universities, ultimately 2 years later, forcing CEU out of the country and taking over other universities by censoring and dictating what they could teach. So Viktor Orban has become not only a long-time 15-year prime minister in Hungary, but the icon of anti-democratic nationalists on both sides of the Atlantic. And he's had a big influence on Donald Trump's MAGA movement. Steve Bannon has declared that Orban was Trump before there was Trump. And I think that's certainly amply demonstrated by the story I've just told. Orban developed a playbook, a political playbook, that has kept him in power since he was first elected in 2010, and it's now a blueprint, and it's been very formally adopted for Trump's Project 2025. So here's what the Orban playbook prescribes. I'm going to summarize it, and what Trump really has been doing, I think we can see. First, take over your party and enforce party discipline through the constant use of political threats to stamp out dissent within the party. Second, build your base by appealing to fear and hate and branding immigrants and cultural minorities as threats to society and demonizing your opponents as enemies of the people. Third, use misinformation, disinformation, and lies to justify what you're doing. Fourth, use your election to claim a sweeping mandate even if you don't win a majority. And as I'll point out later, that's certainly been followed very clearly by President Trump. Fifth, centralize your power by destroying the civil service and dismantling the professional government. Sixth, redefine the rule of law as your rule by executive decree. Seventh, eliminate checks and balances and separation of powers by taking over the legislature, the courts, the media, and civil society. Eighth, create an oligarchy to supervise the economy and reward it with special access to state resources. Ninth, ally yourself with other authoritarians, and this is certainly what Orban did, like Vladimir Putin, and support his effort to undermine European democracies and attack sovereign countries like Ukraine. It certainly sounds familiar here as well. And 10th, above all, get the public to believe all this is necessary and that resistance is futile. So that's the playbook developed by Viktor Orban, and a playbook that I think now sounds very familiar in terms of almost 5 weeks of the Trump presidency. But to get a sense of Orban's influence elsewhere in Europe, let's look at what's happening where democracy is struggling in many other parts of Europe. There's bad news in Austria, where a political party founded by former Nazis will soon be part of a new coalition government this year, headed by a leader who has ties directly to Putin and opposes European support for Ukraine. A similar right-wing nationalist government has taken over next door in Slovakia, in both cases influenced very much by the Orban playbook. Europe's 3 biggest countries, which are perhaps the most important ones to focus on, Italy, France, and Germany, all have swung to the right, as you've heard earlier. But so far, they are still very much democracies. Italy has a far-right government headed by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who's followed parts of the Orban playbook, but has been pushed toward the center and has softened her position on the hot-button issues of immigration and Ukraine. In France, the far-right party of Marine Le Pen won last year's parliamentary elections, but a coalition of opposition parties, prodded by Emmanuel Macron, united to defeat her, to deny her a parliamentary majority last year. Their resistance will be tested again by new elections in June, and it's uncertain what, at this point, the outcome will be. In Germany, perhaps most importantly, and certainly most imminently, given the fact that the elections are tomorrow, the center-left government headed by Olaf Scholz fell at the end of last year. Parliamentary elections are taking place tomorrow that will determine whether the far-right AfD party, Alternative for Germany, will become part of a new government. Viktor Orban, Elon Musk, and J.D. Vance have all endorsed the AfD, but the polls show that 71% of Germans continue to believe that the AfD is a threat to democracy because of its continuing connections directly to the Nazi past and many of the past policies. Poland, the biggest new democracy in Eastern Europe, at first adopted but now is resisting the Orban model, a far-right government that was elected in 2015, almost destroyed the independence of the judiciary, but opposition parties united to defend the courts and defeat the regime in 2023, replacing it with a centrist government headed by Donald Tusk, with a strong commitment to restore Polish democracy. So that is a snapshot of the current state of democracy governance in Europe. So what lessons can we draw from all this? One lesson, a very important lesson, is that populist movements start as reactions to destabilizing events, not surprisingly, like economic or cultural or pandemic upheavals. And we've talked about those already quite a bit. And it's important to listen to these movements, to understand their demand for a political response and their interests and what they're pursuing, and to show how democracy can give people influence and ability to adapt to change, while authoritarianism is likely only to suppress their voices and their freedom. Now, that's the message that needs to be delivered. Responding to populism can be done by building coalitions for economic fairness or identity fairness on issues like health care, education, taxes, and public spending. There are many historical examples of this, even in the U.S., or especially perhaps in the U.S., like the American Farmer Labor Coalition that brought together urban workers, white farmers, and black sharecroppers and led to the progressive movement and the New Deal in the 20th century. Today, there's an urgent need for this kind of new coalition of left and right. A second lesson is that defending democracy actually is the most patriotic cause of any nation. In the Orban playbook, the national flag is hijacked by the authoritarian leader and not otherwise available to the public other than those who are his followers. The flag must be reclaimed as a symbol of the rule of law of a nation built on human rights and freedoms and alliances and humanitarian values. And when these soft power assets are destroyed, as I fear they may be right now being destroyed, a huge void opens up that can be filled by other authoritarians, in this case like Xi and Putin, who were the ultimate political models for Orban and his followers. A third lesson is that Orban's playbook demonizes opponents and labels anyone who doesn't support the leader as an enemy of the people. This stigma is enforced by targeting opponents with penalties like tax audits, or the denials of accreditation, or harassment investigations, or the withdrawing of police protection, or any number of other ways in which an authoritarian can weaponize the state to undermine and destroy democratic opponents. The result is a hollowed-out shell of democracy like Viktor Orban's Hungary. The U.S. may be different and better situated to resist authoritarianism. It's 30 times bigger and infinitely more diverse than Hungary, and its diversity is the very source of economic and cultural strength. The U.S. has an enormous and active civil society, a judiciary that remains mostly independent, a free and open, if partially captured and manipulated media, and a constitution that guarantees the rights of the people to challenge and change their government. Donald Trump won less than 50% of the vote in last fall's election, and his approval rating is well below that in recent polls. This is not a mandate for hollowing out American democracy. So let me conclude by indicating that current national polls now show that 70% of Americans do see democracy, and I know it needs definition, and we've been in the process of defining it today, as a core American value. Resistance to the assault on democracy is not only possible, it's essential. And it can work, as shown by the rapidly growing number of successful lawsuits that have been brought against Trump's, pending lawsuits that have been brought against Trump's flood of executive dictates, and the grassroots mobilization of civil society groups across the country. Defending democracy is a long game. For 2.5 centuries, Americans have organized and fought to expand the right to vote, to achieve equal protection, oppose intolerance and political violence, gain freedom of speech and religion, and guarantee due process of law. These goals may seem now to be blocked by the Trump administration, but the U.S. is not Germany in the 1930s or Hungary in 2025, because citizens across the country can begin to act and are doing so to resist authoritarianism. Resistance is hard work and sometimes may seem futile, but every act counts, and many acts together can make a difference. 6 decades ago in South Africa during apartheid, Robert Kennedy eloquently described how this can happen. The original Robert Kennedy. And I'll end with his eloquent words. Each time a person stands up, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring. Those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression. So those are the marching orders for those who would save what they believe to be a grave threat to democracy in America, and also in Hungary, where there is perhaps less hope, but we hope nonetheless. Thank you.